In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about tips for how to succeed in college. And we'll talk a little bit about specifically different things you need to do to succeed in online courses. But what I'm going to talk about is really applicable to all sorts of courses, whether they are in person, hybrid, or online. So, what we're going to talk about on the next couple of pages includes talking about time, how to take notes, how to study, metacognition, and then what I like to call Professor Google. So let's start by talking a little bit more about time. In reality, learning takes time. There's no way around it. There are ways to be more efficient in the time that you spend studying and learning, but generally speaking, it takes time to learn. We have not yet figured out a way to just download information into someone's brain. So, for the meantime, we have to spend time with material and make those connections in the neurons in our brains in order to really understand something and memorize something. So, let's start by talking a little bit about the time commitments for a course if you're taking a course in person. For a biology course, you have about 3 hours of lecture per week and about 3 hours of lab per week. So that means that you spend 6 hours in class, in a classroom setting, learning the material. In addition to that, the rule of thumb for college courses is that for each hour you spend in class, you should be spending between 2 and 3 hours outside of class, either studying, taking notes, reading, or completing assignments. So we'll say that 2 hours for every hour that you spend in class. So we'll take this 6 hours, we're going to multiply it by 2 to give us 12 more hours. So if you're taking an in-person class, and we're specifically talking about a science course, which is a 4 credit hour course that meets in person approximately 6 hours per week. So generally speaking, the time that it should take you to really complete the course and really fully grasp and understand the material would be those 12 hours of study time plus the 6 hours in class, which gives you about 18 hours per week. Now, in an online class, you don't have the strict time requirements to be sitting in a classroom learning the material, but you have to compensate for that by learning the material on your own time in an online environment. So you should still be spending about 18 hours a week with that material. And about 6 hours of that time should be spent reading the textbook or watching videos that your professor has posted or completing assignments that the instructor has posted to help teach you the material. Plus, you have that additional 12 hours of studying, reading, and really seeing if you understand the material. Now, I know I hear students a lot say, but I have other stuff going on in my life. You might be taking other courses. You may have a full-time job. You might have kids that you're taking care of. And I am empathetic to that. But once again, learning comes down to time. And so it really comes down to whether you have the time to learn the material or not. If you have all of those other priorities in your life, then it might not be the best time for you to be in college, or it might not be the best time for you to take a full load of courses in college. Maybe you would be better off taking fewer courses so that you have the time to really dedicate to them. With online courses, I also want to stress that it's important to schedule time. For an in-person class, you have a set schedule every week where you have to go to campus, sit in a classroom, and learn the material with the teacher. In an online environment, the great thing is that you have more flexibility as to whether or when you do that. You can do it after work, before work. You can do it at 2 o'clock in the morning. It doesn't matter, but you still need to schedule that time because if you don't specifically schedule that time, then it will likely fall to kind of the back burner of your priorities and you're going to end up trying to cram and learn all this information at the last minute. And that's not a good way to learn information. Cramming is never a good way to really understand information and retain it long term. The next thing I would like to talk about is note taking. So, a lot of students want to just read information or listen to information or watch a video, and they think that that is an adequate way to learn the material. But in reality, the research has shown that actually physically writing down notes by hand is the best way to learn the material. And I know a lot of students complain that it takes a lot of time, but remember that time equals learning for the most part. So I highly encourage you to write down notes by hand. And I say by hand because I mean, don't just type the notes out because typing is not the same thing as writing. I also recommend that you rewrite your notes. Because repetition is helpful. And when you rewrite your notes, you might start to think about things that you maybe didn't understand the first time around. And so then you can go back and try to look up that information and fill in the gaps. I also recommend that you have a way of keeping track of questions. So as you're writing down your notes, let's say you're watching a video and you're writing down notes as you go, and you come across a concept that you don't understand. If you don't stop right away and somehow indicate that you need to ask your professor a question, you're probably going to forget that you have a question about that. So I recommend getting sticky notes or a highlighter or something to somehow indicate that you need to go back and look at that information and revisit it and maybe ask a question about it or look it up using another source. As you're taking notes, look up information that you don't understand. For example, let's say you're watching a video that your professor has posted and you're taking notes, and you realize that you have a lot of questions and you're not really fully understanding this material. Now, it's hard because if, let's say you're studying at 2 a.m. on a Saturday and your professor might not be available right then and there, but you have a lot of other resources available to you. So you can look up the information in your textbook. So maybe the textbook explains it in a way that is different than how your professor explained it, that maybe helps clarify it. You can also look it up online, although we'll talk a little bit more about some of the dangers of looking stuff up online a little bit later in this presentation. I also recommend when you're writing down notes that you get creative. So you can use things like different colored pens or different highlighters, but I also recommend that you draw out concepts. It's okay if you're not an artist. Oftentimes, just drawing a circle and squiggly lines might help you understand what something looks like or how it works. You can use tables to compare and contrast concepts. So rather than just writing down, say, the different organelles of a cell, you can actually put that into a chart to help you better organize your thoughts. I also recommend that you use an outline format. And what I mean by that is with an outline format, you can have one line be a header, and then everything that comes underneath it is related specifically to that header. So, for example, you could say that number one, you're talking about organelles. And then underneath the organelles, you can say A is the nucleus. And then underneath the nucleus, you could take a look at things like the nuclear membrane and the nucleolus. And then you can come back up here to B and talk about the mitochondria. So this is just another way to organize your thoughts. So you know that everything kind of within each kind of subcategory falls into or is related to everything above it in the higher category. Also, building on this idea of getting creative, think about writing out the same information, but in different ways. For example, can I write it out as an outline, but then also put it into a chart or table? Or can I have a chart or table that I then draw out the concept using a picture? This helps your brain to really process the information in different ways, and it's more likely to stick. Our next topic is the topic of studying. And this really kind of relates to some of the stuff we've already talked about. So, when it comes to studying, once again, the main thing is time. So, you need to make sure that you schedule time, and it's better to do it in kind of small chunks of time rather than one big cram session. So, don't cram right before the exam. So, it's best to study as you are going through the material. And that's kind of where it comes into play with asking questions and looking up information that you don't understand as you're learning it. With studying, repetition is key. The more times you look at something or think about something, the more likely you are to remember it. So study over and over and over again, but do it in those small chunks of time. This also comes into play with rewriting your notes. When I was in college, I had a strategy where I used to write down my notes 3 times. The first time I wrote down my notes was when I was in class listening to the lecture. And so I was just kind of writing down anything I could, but I wasn't necessarily processing what the professor was saying. I was just writing down anything that I could. And then usually within 24 hours of class, I would go and rewrite my notes for that particular class session. And in rewriting my notes, I would organize them. So I would put them in maybe an outline format. And I would look up concepts that I didn't understand. And if there was something I really didn't understand that I couldn't find in the textbook, I would actually go talk to the professor during his or her office hours and ask for help. The third time that I rewrote my notes was usually within 24 to 48 hours before the exam. And in doing so, it helped me kind of jog my memory and remember what we had talked about in class. And so the act of writing my notes was really how I studied. Now, I know a lot of people like to use flashcards, and flashcards are great for some people. I personally found that the act of writing the flashcards was essentially the same as just rewriting my notes again. So it wasn't necessarily using the flashcards that helped me, it was writing the information on the card to begin with. So if you're using someone else's flashcards, then you're probably not getting the full benefit out of those flashcards as compared to if you had written them out yourself. Now let's take a look at a concept known as metacognition. And metacognition has been explained to me as thinking about thinking. And this is something that I did not do well as a college student, but I did much better when I was in grad school. And what I mean by this is, as you are writing notes and as you are studying, you should be asking yourselves some questions. So, first of all, you should ask, do I understand this? So, you might read something or listen to something and think, like, yeah, okay, I get it. But do you really understand it? And some ways to ask yourself whether you understand it or not is ask if you can apply it in different contexts. Another way to think about whether you understand something is, could you explain it to someone else? Another way to think about this is, can you make analogies between this novel information and information that you already know? And there are additional ways of kind of thinking about thinking, but really it comes down to really asking yourself, do I understand this information? I just read it, I just watched a video on it, I just wrote notes on it, but do I really understand it? And if the answer is no, then it means that you need to go back and think about it some more and think about, does this make sense? The last bit that I want to talk about is what I like to call Professor Google. And what I'm really talking about are the pros and cons of technology. So, to give you some background, I graduated from high school in the year 2000. I did have a computer when I went to college, but I did not have a laptop because they were prohibitively expensive at the time that I went to school. I didn't have a smartphone until I was already done with graduate school several years later. So, I did not go through higher education having Google in my pocket. Now, that being said, I think technology is amazing, and I love having an iPad and a smartphone and a computer, and that they're all portable and I can take them anywhere I go. But it's really important that you're able to discern whether a source is a good source or not. And you also have to realize that just because Google knows it doesn't necessarily mean that you know it. So this brings me to a couple of tips here. So don't just search for information. So don't just search for information on the internet. There is so much information out there that it could take you really the rest of your life to find the information that you are looking for. Meanwhile, your professor has curated materials for you and has taken that task of trying to figure out what on Google is real and what is crap. And they've given you resources saying that these are good resources that covers the information in the depth and the breadth of what is covered in this class. So that leads me to saying, use the resources your professor provides. And I'll add the caveat here. So use this first. All right. And when I'm talking about resources, I'm talking about things like textbooks, videos, reading materials, assignments, websites, et cetera, et cetera. So Your instructor probably has a lot of resources. Oh, I forgot to include things like PowerPoint presentations. So your professor has already gone through the time and the effort of figuring out what resources are good for you to learn this material from. So if you are going through assignments and you're just Googling the answer to everything, you are likely getting information that either is not credible or it doesn't directly relate to the class. So, for example, I teach biology, and in just the courses that I teach, the word nucleus has three different meanings depending on what we are talking about. So, we could be talking about the nucleus of an atom, we could be talking about the nucleus of a cell, or we could be talking about a group of neuron cell bodies and dendrites in the brain called a nucleus. And I have had students before give me an answer on a worksheet where I've asked, what is the nucleus? And they might answer something about the cell when we're talking about atoms. And so that proves to me that the student Googled, what is the nucleus? And just wrote down the first thing that they saw. And they didn't bother to really think about the context of the course and whether what they wrote down made sense. So there was absolutely no learning or no processing that occurred between Googling something and just writing something down. Now, all that being said, Google is not evil. So, Google is a great resource. And not just Google, of course, there are other search engines out there. But you need to be very critical of your sources. So, be critical of your sources. All right, so think about as you are Googling something, as you find the information. So think about things like the context of the course. So does the information that you are reading on Google match what you are learning in the course? If not, you need to keep searching. Think about things like the depth of the course. If you're in an introductory level course and you're writing down information from Google that's using really advanced scientific terminology or something that just it doesn't seem like you really understand what it's saying, then it's probably above where you're learning that information and you need to build up to that. So, for example, I have a master's degree in biology, so I can talk about information at a graduate level, but I couldn't talk about it when I was a freshman taking Bio 101. It took me 7 years of college to get to the point where I could use that terminology and really understand it and be able to apply it. The other thing you need to worry about is avoiding plagiarism. And what I mean by this is I have a lot of students that look up a concept on Google and they copy and paste directly from Google. And that is considered plagiarism, and it is never okay. First of all, you're stealing someone else's work and you are proving it or passing it off as your own, which is considered cheating, illegal, plagiarism, unethical. Just don't do it. Additionally, it doesn't tell me that you understand the material because all you're doing is copying and pasting it down. I could copy and paste a transcript in Latin and, just by looking at the letters and characters and writing it down in another area, but that doesn't mean I understand what I wrote down. I don't speak Latin. I've never studied Latin. I'm not going to understand what I'm writing. I'm just copying from something else. So I hope you found this video helpful with regards to how to take notes, how to study, and where to find information. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to discuss with you ways to maybe focus your studying or improve your note-taking skills.